Welcome to The Appleseed, the storytelling podcast from BYUradio, where your family can gather for great stories from great storytellers in every episode. Stories bring us together, and we hope the stories on the show will spark memories and thoughts that you can share with the people you love. I'm your host, Sam Payne, and we'll start this episode with a story from North Carolina storyteller Donald Davis. He'll share with us the story of a wonderful childhood memory, a day spent with his grandparents in their mountain home. You'll love the story, and if it brings to mind someone for you that's kind of like someone in the story, well, we wouldn't hate that at all. The story is called Blackberries, and Donald was kind enough to share it with us live in the Appleseed studio. Here he is.
When I was a little boy, I grew up in the Smoky Mountains in North Carolina. And as much as anything, I loved to spend time visiting at my grandparents' house. It was my mother's parents, my granddaddy Walker and my grandmother Walker, and they lived on a farm that was, well, you left town with the road paved. And then pretty soon, the road was just paved in the middle with gravel on the side in case you met somebody and you never did meet anybody. And then pretty soon there was no pavement, there was just gravel. And then a little while after that, there was no gravel, there was just dirt. And then after that, there was no road. My grandparents lived in a gated community. My daddy would stop the car and I'd get out and open the gate. And he'd drive through into the cow pasture and then I'd close the gate. And we'd go on these two little tracks down the edge of the cow pasture to the next gate. And then I'd open it and we'd go through and I'd close the gate. And now we were going along the edge of the cornfield till we got to the last gate. And then I'd open it and we'd go through the creek and up in front of this big old log house. And that's where my grandparents lived. My granddaddy was a farmer. He raised rocks. They would come up every springtime when he plowed in the spring. And all summer, he could trap his grandchildren, if possible, into carrying rocks out of the fields. And they'd come back again next year. He was a wonderful, wonderful farmer. He would graft trees. I have his little grafting book. It was published in 1918. And he would create a tree that would have 4 kinds of apples on one tree. Or a tree that would have sweet cherries on one side and sour cherries on the other side. He would graft rose bushes for my grandmother with different roses on the same bush. And his great achievement was that he grafted a quince and a pear. They were very closely related. He had never heard of anybody doing that, but he did it and it worked. He also could find the bee trees. And that would be one of my jobs when I would go spend time out there. I would come with him and we'd go up into a big field of clover above the barn where bees would be flying all around because the clover was all in bloom. You know, what bees do is they go out to gather the nectar, and they go on and on and on and on and on till they're totally loaded. And when they're totally loaded, then they fly straight back to the beehive. And if it's wild bees, they're going to fly back to a hollow tree. So we would go up there in the clover, and he would pick out a bee and start watching it. It would go here and 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 here. And it's getting more and more loaded and more and more loaded and more and more loaded. And all of a sudden, it takes off in a straight line, zoom. And he watches that bee till it goes out of sight. And then he would take me and he would put me on the spot where he last saw the bee. And then he would come up to where I was, and we'd start watching for bees again. And pretty soon we'd see a bee coming, shoom, past where we were, and he'd keep going. And he'd move me. And he'd see another bee, and he'd keep moving me. And finally, there would be more bees coming, and we would get all the way to a hollow tree that was full of wild honey. And he could do that and find that wild honey just like nobody else that we ever knew. I was about 8 years old, and I was spending a week out there in the summertime. And he came in one afternoon, and he said to my grandmother, he said, Zeffie, I was way up on the mountain this afternoon, and guess what? The blackberries are just as ripe as they can be. We need to go tomorrow and pick blackberries. Well, the next morning we got up, and my grandmother got us all ready to go. She got me to put on one of my granddaddy's big, long-sleeve shirts that was way too big for me, but then she put rubber bands around it down at the wrists. And then she opened it up at the top, and she got sulfur that she had gotten from the drugstore, and she shook sulfur down inside my shirt and then buttoned it up, and I had to jump around. This is so the ticks and chiggers couldn't get us. My granddaddy got all fixed up the same way. She got all fixed up the same way. She gave my granddaddy a big bucket. She gave me a little bucket, and she got 2 buckets for herself. And we left the house and we went way up past where the cows went. We got way up on the mountain, and finally we came to where there were just acres and acres of blackberry briars covered with great big, fat, ripe, juicy blackberries. She said, now, you need to watch out for snakes, because you know when the blackberries get ripe, snakes will come and hide in the blackberries trying to catch a bird when the birds come and eat the blackberries. So just watch out for them. So I was picking blackberries just like that, one after another. My granddaddy would pick about 3 blackberries and eat 2 and put one in his bucket. And my grandmother, with a bucket on each arm, was picking with both hands at the same time. They were going that way. I was going that way. Pretty soon, we couldn't see each other, but that was okay. We knew where we were. When all of a sudden, I heard a little sound. Something went, and I looked, and just about right there was a little baby bear cub eating blackberries. And you know what I thought? That little baby bear cub's not going to be out here by himself. I bet his mama's somewhere. And I looked past him, and sure enough, right over there was his mama. And she had with her not 1, but 2 more little baby bear cubs. It'd have been a fat winter. She had had 3 babies. And all of a sudden, I took off running back to where my grandparents were, but my feet didn't work. My feet just started jumping up and down. I was trying to run, but my feet were just jumping up and down. And I was yelling, help, 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 help. And here came my granddaddy running. What's the matter? There's bears. And he saw the bears. And he took his bucket and reached in his pocket, and he got out his pocket knife, and he opened up the blade. I thought, he's going to kill a bear with a little knife. No, he got hold of the blade, and he started banging on the bucket. Bam, 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 bam. Go home, bears. Go home, bears. Go get your own blackberries. These are our blackberries. Woo! Go home, bears. Go home, bears. And that mama bear gathered up those babies, and they took off and left. And we picked blackberries till our buckets were so heaped up, they wouldn't even hold anymore. And then we walked all the way back down to the house. We had now 4 big buckets of blackberries full to the top, and I was totally exhausted. My grandmother said, why don't you go lie down, and you can even take a little nap if you want to. And by the time you wake up, I bet supper will be ready. And I went in and laid down on the bed in the room where I always slept. It was a feather bed in there. And when I woke up, the house smelled so good. And I came in the kitchen, and I said, what is that smells so good, so good? My grandmother said, I've spent all afternoon making blackberry pies. Now let's have supper. We sat down at the table, and you want to know what we had for an appetizer? For an appetizer, we had a big piece of blackberry pie. And then you know what we had for vegetables? For vegetables, we had another big piece of blackberry pie. And then for the main course, we had a great big piece of blackberry pie. And for bread, we had a big piece of blackberry pie, but you'll never guess what we had for dessert. One more big piece of blackberry pie. I had 5 big pieces of blackberry pie, and I was as full of sugar and happy as I could be. Well, the next day, my mother came to get me to take me home. And before she got there, my grandmother gathered me up and she said, "Now, before your mama gets here, let's talk just a minute. You know, when you get home, she always asks you, 'What did you do at your grandmother's house?'" I said, "Yes, she asks me that all the time. It's just dumb. She asks me that." She said, "Well, she's going to ask you that again. This time I know she is. And maybe you should think about it. And maybe you better not tell her everything that happened." I said, "Oh, I thought about that. I'm not going to tell her about those bears. Don't worry about that." She said, "That's not what I'm talking about. You better not tell her that I fed you 5 pieces of blackberry pie and nothing else for your supper, or she might not let you come back again." And when I got home and my mother asked me what happened at my grandmother's house, I told her all about the bears. Years passed, and I was in high school. And one day we were visiting out at my grandmother's house, and she came over to me and she said, "Do you remember when you were little, that time we went to pick the blackberries and we saw the bears?" I said, "I do." And she said, "Remember what we had for supper that night?" I said, "I do. I had 5 pieces of blackberry pie. You might have had more than that." And she said, "And remember what I told you after that?" I said, "Yes, you told me not to tell my mother about having all that blackberry pie." She said, "You know why I told you that?" I said, "No." She said, "I told you that because the truth is important. And we need to always tell the truth. And I told you that for your mother's benefit. Because if you'd gone home and your mother had said, 'What happened at your grandmother's house?' and you said, 'She let me have 5 pieces of blackberry pie for my supper,' what would your mother have said? She would have said, 'She shouldn't have done that. You shouldn't have done that.' And then my grandmother looked at me and said, 'Did that blackberry pie hurt you?' I said, 'No.' Then if your mother said, 'You shouldn't have done that,' she would have been telling a lie. And I needed to protect your mother from telling a lie. And so we had to be sure that we protected the truth. You see now why I like to spend time at her house? Because almost every time I went, I learned something just about as good as that.
That was Donald Davis with his story, Blackberries. And listening to Donald's story fills me with grandparent memories of my own. Maybe it's the same with you. But it also fills my memory with stories of folks who weren't my grandparents, but who were like grandparents, folks who looked after me when I was a kid. All the time I was growing up, I lived across the street from Bob and Luana Smith. And my brothers and I all thought they had the best yard to play in. There was a grass hill in their front yard that you could roll down on a summer day in your swimming trunks right into the cool water of the irrigation ditch that ran along the front edge of their property. They had a big potato cellar dug into the hill behind their house with big, heavy cellar doors set at an angle, and you could climb the hill to the top of the cellar and slide down those big cellar doors and tumble onto the grass of their backyard. They had apple trees filled with Granny Smith apples. In fact, I thought those apples had been named after Luana Smith. Grandma Smith is what my brothers and I called her. And every time we'd knock on her door and ask if we could play in her yard, she'd disappear for a moment into the kitchen and come back with a popsicle for each of us. Well, I grew up and moved away, went to college, got married, had kids. And I remember coming back to my hometown one weekend, years and years after I'd last slid down those cellar doors or rolled down the grass hill at Grandma Smith's. And as I drove up my street toward my folks' place, there on the other side of the street was the Smith house. And in the front yard, there were 3 or 4 kids in their swim trunks, soaked in ditch water, sitting on that grass hill, and each of them was sucking on a popsicle. Folks like Grandma Smith, it turns out, don't just take care of me or me and my brothers. They take care of everyone, for as long as they can. Bob and Luana Smith are gone now, but they filled 2 or 3 generations of neighborhood kids with popsicles and Granny Smith apples before they went. And that is an enviable legacy. And that's where Donald's story took me. Where did it take you? And who will you take along?
Lively conversation is guaranteed when we listen to stories on the apple seed.
Hi, Sam here. I just want to tell you about another podcast from BYU Radio. It's one you should really check out. It's called Uncomfy, Sticking with Moments That Challenge Us. And you can listen to it or watch it. It's an audio and video podcast. Now, on Uncomfy, you'll hear stories of real people in moments that challenge their perspective. And instead of getting angry or shutting down or backing off, they stuck with the discomfort. And sometimes that's getting tough feedback from a close friend. Sometimes that's hearing out a colleague from another side of the aisle politically, but in every case, they chose to stay open and curious in those tough moments, and they're glad they did. New episodes of Uncomfy drop every Wednesday. You can listen or watch on the BYU Radio app or wherever you get your podcasts. Uncomfy, Sticking with Moments That Challenge Us. Check it out.
Lively conversation is guaranteed when we listen to stories on the apple seed.
It's great to have you with us on the Apple Seed. Next up, a story from a longtime friend of the show, Angela Lloyd. Angela is no longer with us, and we miss her. But there's a legacy of stories she left behind, shared with audiences large and small over years and years. Shared with us, too, including this one, a story she calls Grandfriends Day. Here's Angela.
It was the Wednesday before Thanksgiving Day. We were at an elementary school. This Wednesday morning, before everyone left for the holiday, was a very unique and special day. It was the day that the children invited their grandparents and their grandfriends to come to school for the morning. And we had been doing some work to get ready for the grandparents. A grandfriend, by the way, is if you know someone who's over 18, who you love, and they love you, and they visit with you sometimes, and they could come on Grandfriends Day if the grandparents were not traveling from near or far. And so the children and I had been developing their curiosity, our curiosity about the grandparents' lives. And this had shown up in the way of stories. And also we wrote the names of the grandparents on a large piece of paper on the door of the classroom. This was to Bubby and Grandpa and Daddy's Daddy and Smooshy and Lala and Nana and Nani and Moo Moo and Bibi. And all their names were on the doors of the classrooms. And our gift that we had were our questions, the questions the children had written to ask their grandparents. Now, some of these questions, they might have already been asked or other questions asked over the telephone in the weeks coming. or in a letter by the older students. And in the older classrooms, the students had made Jeopardy boards so that a grandparent would say, I'll take sports for 10 or history for 40. And this added math to the whole ball game, which made everybody very excited. But I was in the first and second grade classroom on that particular morning at the beginning of the day when we started to pass the basket of questions. The grandparents were all seated in chairs in a circle, the children on the carpet, on the floor, looking up. They'd already taken their grandparents on a tour of the classroom, including the pencil graveyard that they had, which was an aquarium with gravel in it and tiny little, maybe you've seen those tiny little pencils you've worn to a nub as you learn your writing. And now the grandparents were seated in this lovely circle. And mind you, they didn't know each other. But in 45 minutes, those grandparents would all be completely connected to one another from the stories and the questions that were asked. And this was the gold. We just never knew what stories would come from these lovely humans who had come to visit. And I just want to say that a school really is a magnificent place. And each school is a world of its own. And in some way, it's quite separate from the outside world. And so on a day when all these guests would come was very special. Everything was shiny, including the children. So the basket was passed, and the children had signed the questions. So a grandparent might not get their grandchild's question, but they would know which child had asked. And of course, the learning at our school was very much starting with, what do you know about this subject? What would you like to know about this subject? How are we going to go about learning it? Which is exactly what we were doing with our family members. So the basket was passed. And then a woman pulled a question, and it said, have you ever dissected anything like a cow or a horse or a frog? And the woman who pulled the question, she looked at it and she said, we had biology when I was in high school before lunch and after lunch. And we heard the room go, oh. And the children were looking up. She said, we could not eat our lunch. And she looked at the children. We could not eat our lunch that day. But we had to go back to class. And then after class, we all went out for hamburgers together for the first time ever. The basket was passed. Another person, a fellow, pulled a question. It was, what subject did he love the most in college? Spelling college had been a thing in the classroom a few days before. He got the question and he said, I would say it was mathematics. And someone said, and why? Why was it mathematics? And he leaned back and he said, because there was nothing to memorize. There was only something to understand. And I looked at the children, and they were all thinking about, we're learning a times table, and we're mesmerizing it right now. Something to look forward to. The next person who took the basket was an elderly gentleman, and rather than taking a new question, he said, I have a story that goes with that other question. And he looked at the children and he said, I was in medical school and I had a partner, a study partner, and we each had our own cadaver. I said to him, would you please tell the children what a cadaver is? And he said, we each had our own dead body. All the children sat up very straight. He said, in fact, we studied our own dead body for a whole year, and we were so comfortable doing that we ate our lunch on the dead body. We could just open our paper bag and the wax paper and unfold and have our sandwiches with our dead body. And I thought, oh, okay, that's where would you hear that? Where would you hear that anywhere in the world? Nowhere but here. And lastly, I was in another classroom later that day, and a woman pulled a question, and it was, what was it that you chose to do when you were a very young child? How did you spend your time when no one was asking you to do anything? And she pulled the question, and she said, my parents loved to garden, and I sometimes would be next to my mother and my father. And one day my father, he marked out a 3-foot square with poles and rope. And he said, this was my garden. And she said, I loved it. I could plant in it. I could dig up plants and move them across the garden, like the next morning to see if they were growing. I learned later that's not very useful. But she said, I loved gardening. And I said, and what was it that became your work? And she looked up, she looked at us, and she said, I'm a landscape architect. And she looked at us and she said, I never thought about that before. I am a landscape architect. And she said, and my plants live longer when I transplant them. And the teacher got up and went across her desk and came back with a calendar, a 12-month calendar of the photographs of this woman's gardens, landscape gardens she had been making in San Francisco. Magnificent 12-month, beautiful photographs of her gardens. Those days have always been remarkable. I always look forward to them, and it really changed in that we started to send story prompts home to the parents, and we connected them with the children's days in school. And so stories really started to follow and roll, and parents would come up to me and say, oh, we love those story prompts. And the other day, my daughter was talking to me about peace and war, and he said, that's because of the story prompts. Thank you so much for the story prompts.
That was Angela Lloyd with Grandfriends Day. Do you have fond or funny memories of your grandparents? Or do you have other grandfriends in your life? How did you get to know them? And how did they become special to you? I bet you've got some stories. We hope you'll share them with the people you love. In fact, we hope you'll share the stories with us. We might share them on the show. You can message us on social media or email us at theappleseed@byu.edu. That's theappleseed, all one word, at byu.edu. Now, Delba Tidwell left us a message that said, I've been looking for something to listen to that's good and uplifting, especially at night when I'm trying to relax and go to sleep. Thanks, Tilda. Listen, we love words like good and uplifting. Thanks for using those words in connection with the Appleseed podcast. And stories are great for bedtime, aren't they? A truth we've all known since we were babies. Thanks so much for reaching out. We loved hearing from you, and we're sure glad you're listening. We want to thank Donald Davis and Angela Lloyd for their tales today. You've listened to their stories. Now it's time to share some of your own. The Appleseed is produced by me, Sam Payne, Wendy Folsom, Brian Tanner, and Kira Van Dam. The rest of the Appleseed team is Tristan Schetzel, Kay Hendricks, and Nico Wetzel. We're pleased and proud to be among the many podcasts produced by the BYUradio family of shows. If you want more great storytelling for the whole family, then search for our companion podcast, Kaboom, where you'll hear original audio adventures for the whole family. You can find any episode of The Appleseed or Kaboom on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, on the BYU Radio app, or at byuradio.org. Don't forget to subscribe, rate us, and leave a review. That's how the shows grow. I'm Sam Payne, and we can't wait to be with you again on The Appleseed.